Okay, AP U.S. Government Politics. This is the part 5 in the AP course, how they outline things. So AP U.S. Government Politics Review Part 5, again from Steve Miller from Walter Johnson High School with my narrative. So public policy will be about 10% of the exam. These percentages are a little weird because a lot of times the questions cover more than one thing. So it'll be a question that's about Congress, but it'll also be about public policy, or a question about the Supreme Court and interest groups at the same time. So it's a little funky, but it kind of gives you an idea of how much time to spend on each of the subjects. So what are we looking at with public policy? Policy making in a federal system, the formation of the policy agenda, the role of institutions in the enactment of policy, the role of the bureaucracy and the courts in policy implementation and interpretation. So linkages between policy processes and the following. We're going to look to see how policy works with all of these factors of policy making. Political institutions and federalism, political parties, interest groups, public opinion, how it shapes policy, elections, and policy networks, issue networks, iron triangles. So, the policy-making process, the most important decision is what to make a policy about, what to put on the agenda. Shared beliefs determine what is legitimate. The legitimate scope of government action is always getting larger, though. And we talked about that. For example, how the media kind of brings up things and kind of asks, why hasn't the government done something about it? In a crisis, people expect the government to take action. The second step after determining what we're going to have policies about is making a decision. We have to look at the costs and benefits of proposed policies and provide a way to understand how an issue affects political power. We have to determine the cost, any burden that people must or expect to bear, and the benefit, any satisfaction, money or not, that some people must or expect to receive. For example, the issues over Obamacare as a policy. What people really focus in on mostly is the cost and the benefit. Some people bring up the issue of personal liberty, but usually the issue is, will this thing work and will it be too expensive? And who will gain from it and who will lose? And obviously, if you're creating a new insurance policy to cover people who can't ordinarily afford it, somebody's got to pay for it. So the people who can't afford insurance are probably going to basically carry them to some extent. So you have to decide whether that's legitimate or not. And you have to decide, when it comes to costs and benefits in policy, someone is always going to win and someone's always going to lose. Someone's always going to lose. So the dairy industry, when they have a dairy subsidy, they win. Everybody else loses. The reason why nobody freaks out at the dairy subsidy is because everybody loses very little, but the dairy industry gains a lot. So we don't even feel it, even though they gain a great deal from the dairy subsidy. So remember, when you're looking at policy, to think a lot of times in terms of cost and benefit. And there are really only two arguments involved in policy, which is, moral, ethical, ideological implications, and then cost and benefit issues. Important to remember, the perception of costs and benefits affects politics, whether it is accurate or not. So the people who are claiming that Obamacare is going to be the best thing ever, that's going to affect how they argue and view the policy. To people who think it's going to cause the end of the universe, that's going to affect how they approach the policy. So it becomes very political, and oftentimes people, frankly, on lots of policies are arguing about things that aren't real. People consider whether it is legitimate for a group to benefit. That's another issue. And a lot of times when we deal with things like Obamacare or with public subsidies for homeless, jobless people, things like that, there's the argument about whether or not we should be helping those people. And religious beliefs factor in, political beliefs factor in, self-interest factors in, all those kinds of things. Politics is a process of settling disputes over who benefits and who pays, and who ought to benefit and who ought to pay. And people often prefer programs that benefit them at low cost to them. Majoritarian politics. This is when the benefits are distributed to the majority and the costs are distributed as well. benefits a large number, distributes costs to large numbers. An example, antitrust legislation in the 1890s, which basically prevented large businesses from colluding and creating trusts, effective monopolies, things like that. The public indignation was strong but unfocused. Legislation was vague with no specific enforcement agency. It's kind of talking about that example. And I don't think you guys have read up on antitrust legislation, so we're going to move on. But bottom line is, majoritarian politics is when the cost and the benefit affect large numbers of people. Interest group politics, concentrated benefits and concentrated costs. When it benefits a relatively small and identifiable group and the costs are imposed on another small identifiable group. The debate will be carried on with little public knowledge, say labor unions versus business. So labor laws, the fight over labor laws between unions and businesses oftentimes would be perceived as interest group politics, unless they were more broad. And since the number of people in unions, number of workers in unions is now below, I think it's below 10% now, I think it's 9%. Obviously, this would be interest group politics. Most people are not in unions. So the example they give, the labor management conflict of the 1930s, unions won because of support of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the first president to support unions. And why did this happen? Because of economic conditions of the Great Depression, etc. Client politics. So we've covered majoritarian politics and interest group politics. Client politics is when you have concentrated benefits and you have distributed costs. And that's the kind I was describing when I talked about the dairy industry. Small group receives lots of benefits. Costs are widely distributed. There's little incentive to motivate opposition because the people don't feel the cost. And those receiving the benefits become clients of the government. And the examples they give, regulation of the milk industry, sugar production, things like that. It prevents price competition. It keeps prices artificially high. Public is unaware of increased cost. We have, we subsidize milk so much, we have no idea how much it really costs. And it's fairly expensive. So those of you who are lactose intolerant, you're really the losers in this game. Because those of us who drink a lot of milk, we're taking advantage of your tax dollars in a sense. Entrepreneurial politics. Distributed benefits, concentrated costs. Only a few people take the hit. Most people benefit. Costs imposed on a small identifiable group. Success depends on people working on behalf of unorganized majorities. So Ralph Nader. Examples, consumer protection laws. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. In the 1960s and 70s, consumer and environmental laws passed. For the EPA, Auto Safety, Clean Air Act. Danger is the agency may be captured by the regulated industry. In other words, an iron triangle could be formed to the benefit of the industry that's supposed to be watched over and made sure that they don't do bad things. So, for example, Ralph Nader, one of the things he pushed, which had entrepreneurial politics written all over it, is the issue of seat belts should be mandatory in all vehicles. Okay, believe it or not, there was a time in this country where you paid extra for seat belts in your car. And Nader was the guy who really pushed for auto safety and the issue of seat belts. And that meant it cost car makers and car sellers a significant amount of money to put seat belts in and standardize it, but everybody else benefited. Deregulation. It's a movement that's been going on since the late 70s. Things that have been deregulated. In other words, there are less laws to make limit what they do or how they do it, or to watch over these industries. Airfare, the aviation industry is less regulated. Telephone service has been deregulated, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we broke up the monopoly. There used to be one phone company a long time ago. Bell was the phone company. In fact, there was a movie made about the president's analyst, and if you want to watch and kind of see what life was like in the late 60s, you can watch this movie about the president's analyst. He's his psychologist, basically, and all these spies are after him, and one spy group was the one that really went after him first because they want to know what the president's thinking and see the president confides in him. So he's running from all these spies, and it's kind of a comedy. They're kind of making fun of politics and making fun of spy movies and everything. And in the end, he finds out that the spy that started all this, trying to kidnap him, was an agent of the phone company. Because the phone company was this monopolistic giant entity with all this power. But we broke up the phone companies. That's why you have Verizon and AT&T and all that other stuff. And we used to have Southwestern Bell, but that was bought up by AT&T. And trucking's also been deregulated. Deregulation represents a challenge to iron triangles in client politics. If the government is deregulating, then the government has less of a relationship with the industry, which means the industry can't more effectively get perks and benefits, if you will. Economic policy. So now we're moving into, we talked about how politics works, describe different types of policy models, majoritarian politics, entrepreneurial politics, interest group politics, and that kind of stuff. Now we're moving into economic policy, which is one branch of policy. Economic health is a big issue for the United States. Things we debate about: the deficit and the balanced budget. In 1999, Republicans wanted to cut taxes to return the surplus to the voters. Democrats wanted to use it for new programs and to pay down the debt. In 2001, Bush got Congress to pass a huge tax cut using the rationale that surpluses represented the government taking too much money from the taxpayers. In 2003, Bush was asking for more tax cuts. He got them, and he argued that it would stimulate the economy. Republicans have this is a dated PowerPoint. Republicans had given up on the balanced budget issue in favor of tax cuts. Now, once Obama got elected, they went back and said we needed to have a more balanced budget, but they didn't want to raise taxes. They wanted to keep their tax cuts and cut spending. Economic prosperity issues. Disputes about economic prosperity produce majoritarian politics. Voters see connections between national economy and their personal situation. People do not always vote their pocketbooks. They frequently vote based on current conditions of the national economy. Even if their own situation is better, they see an indirect or future effect. People are smart enough to realize that just because they dodge the bullet doesn't mean the bullet's not going to come back around and get them. So people look at the economic health of the country to vote a lot of times, not just how they're doing. If you have bad luck and you lose your job and everybody else is doing okay and you think it's going to be pretty easy to find another job, you're still going to probably vote for the status quo. If you've got a good job but you're worried about holding on to it, you're probably going to vote for somebody new. Politics of taxing and spending, fiscal policy. Majoritarian politics leads to conflicting goals. We want to lower taxes, we want to balance budgets, but we want new programs for problems that haven't been solved. So taxpayers want things which are in conflict with each other. The old you can't have your cake and eat it too kind of problem. How do we fix all of these problems using the government if we don't want to pay for government through taxes? Classic conflict. So, the real solution if you want to have a balanced budget is you either have to have high taxes or you have to lower the responsibilities that you've assigned government. Economic theories, monetarism. They argue that inflation comes from too much money chasing too few goods. So what you do is you control the money supply. You increase the money supply at the same rate as the economy is growing. You decrease the money supply if there's too much money in the system. And the way they do that is by controlling the exchange. There's the discount rate and the interest rates. Basically, the Federal Reserve is the part of the government that controls monetary policy. And they can use the discount rate, which is the interest they charge banks who take money from them, to change national interest rates. And the higher the interest rate, the more money you take out of the system. So you can lower inflation that way. Another way is the withholding, not the withholding, what's that rate called? There's a percentage of money that banks are required to hold on to. and the Federal Reserve can increase the amount of that money that the banks have to hold on to out of the money they're loaning and people have in the bank. And that can increase or decrease the amount of money available. So what they're really focused in on is inflation and deflation, having too much money out there or maybe too little money. Keynesianism argues that the government should create the right level of demand. If demand is too slow, they argue the government should spend money even if deficit spending results. But really, a nuanced vision of Keynesianism is that enormous government spending to improve the economy is really for crisis situations. The government's not supposed to constantly spend money to create demand. It's supposed to spend money to create demand when you're in crisis, bring you back into a normal state of things, and then reduce its role. That's my understanding of Keynesianism. Planning. Some people argue for central planning. This is what the communists did. They argue free markets too unreliable. Government should plan parts of the country's economic activity, have wage and price controls, for example. Significant central planning has been shown historically to fail miserably and lead to long lines of people waiting for a chance to get toilet paper at stores, which is bad because you never want to run out of that, ever. Supply side economics. They argue that less government interference and tax cuts will result in a stimulated economy and therefore more government revenue instead of less. Historically, that hasn't worked. Historically, when we cut taxes to increase revenue, it really hasn't worked too well. It sometimes improves business, but it doesn't fix the tax deficit, so to speak, that's created. The deficit grows. You can have the supply. What I'm saying here, supply side economics can improve the economy, but at the same time, it's increasing the deficit. There hasn't been any real evidence of a supply side economics effectively producing more income for the government to reduce the deficit and improving the economy at the same time. Not any significant correlation there. Reaganomics was a combination of monetarism, supply-side tax cuts, and domestic budget cutting. Eventually, the economy was stimulated, but there were huge deficits. He's the big deficit monster. He's the first president who really just made the deficit grow and the national debt grow enormously, except for presidents under times of war. Reagan agreed to raise taxes, though, 3 times after his initial supply-side tax cuts. Why? Because his advisors and he decided that supply-side economics wasn't working too well. They argued that domestic budget cutting and the monetarism stuff was working okay, but they backed away from supply-side economics. The budget was never balanced under Reagan or George H.W. Bush. Machinery of economic policy making. The Council of Economic Advisors forecasts economic trends, prepares the annual economic report for the president. The Office of Management and Budget prepares the annual budget for the government, federal government. The Secretary of Treasury represents the financial community's point of view about how things are going. The Federal Reserve Board is independent of both the President and Congress. Members are nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, and they serve a 14-year term. They regulate the supply and price of money, so they control monetarism. They can raise and lower interest rates paid by banks to each other, that's the federal funds rate, and to the Fed, the discount rate, and the reserve requirement, that's the word I was looking for, the reserve requirement, the percentage of deposits banks have to loan, may not loan out. So if it's 10%, that means that if you have a bank with $20 million that the people who use their bank have put into their bank, they can only loan out $18 million of it. They have to have 10% or $2 million stay in the bank. See how that works? That's called the reserve rate. So raising these rates, these federal funds rates, discounts rates, the reserve requirement reduces the size of the money supply. Lowering them increases the size of the money supply. When the economy is growing too fast, the Fed tries to reduce the size of the money supply. When it's growing too slowly or shrinking, like in a recession, it tries to increase the size of the money supply. So what's been going on since 2007, 2008 is that the Fed has been creating incredibly low interest rates to increase economic activity, to let the money flow out. And just recently, they're starting to tighten up again and go back to closer to a normal reserve rate, a federal funds rate, discount rate, and tighten up on the money a little bit. Okay, so Congress is important economic policy. They approve all taxes and expenditures. They must consent to wage and price controls. You know, remember the House of Representatives is especially important, right? Because all revenue bills start in the House. Spending money. Politicians have incentives to make two kinds of appeals to voters. They can argue that they're keeping spending down and try to cut the deficit, or they can support the programs the voters like in their district or their state. The budget. The Congressional Budget Act of 1974 established this process. The President submits a budget through the OMB. House and Senate budget committees analyze it. Each committee proposes to its House a budget resolution setting a total budget ceiling. Congress adopts the budget resolutions to guide its decisions. Congress considers appropriations bills and tries to reconcile them with budget resolution. Most, 2/3 of government spending is outside the budget process, though. It's mandatory spending, like entitlements and interest on the debt. The government is already preset. They have no control, in effect, over how much we spend on Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, things like that. And then interest on the debt has to be paid. Reagan was able to get large cuts in domestic spending in 1981, but after that, that was pretty much it. So reducing spending. The Graham-Rudman Balanced Budget Act of 1985 called for automatic across-the-board cuts, known as sequestration, until the budget was balanced. In 1991, it did not work because the President and Congress still found ways to increase spending. And sequestration should sound familiar. We just recently went through some sequestration. Some of you have family members who work in federal jobs and lost some time at work as a result. The Budget Enforcement Act of 1990 and tax increases under George H.W. Bush, the fellow who said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," raised taxes, and didn't get reelected. But still, there was no balanced budget. Clinton budget, 1993, passed with no Republican votes. Increased taxes but cut some spending. The budget was balanced in 1999, mostly as a result of continued economic growth from 1993 to 1999 and through the end of 2000, when a brief recession started. And so a lot of people say the dot-com revolution and the information age revolution basically created the economic boom, and they're probably right. But increased taxes and cutting spending is a kind of a balanced approach to trying to get rid of a deficit spending scenario. So that had something to do with it. I think if I don't know, you know, if I put this together, I probably would have brought up the Newt Gingrich run House. They had a little bit to do with this budget business. It wasn't just Clinton. Taxes. So what is a fair tax? What is fair tax law? This is majoritarian politics because it affects everybody. The tax burden is low relative to other countries. Americans pay less than citizens of most other democracies. Taxes are progressive. Wealthy Americans pay a higher percentage. Client politics makes tax reform difficult. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 resulted in fewer loopholes and lower top marginal rates, 28%, down from 70%. In the earlier part of the century, rates were higher, but there were many more loopholes. Taxes varied with war and peace until after World War II. And this is there's a little more to it, though, because when you look at tax rates, you have to understand what we're taxing. And some income is not considered income. As we learned in the last presidential election, a large amount of money Mitt Romney was paying taxes on, he was only paying a 14% tax rate, even though there was a higher rate than that. And why was he paying effectively 14%? Because much of his money was set up in a kind of an area that's a loophole, so it wasn't considered personal income. And so he didn't have the overall top bracket effective tax rate for a lot of the money he made. So it's a little trickier. And one of the things you'll find in understanding the tax rates is that people who have an agenda will focus in on one thing or the other. But bottom line is, we tax more than just income taxes. We also have direct taxes. You have the withholding taxes in there to help pay for Social Security and things like that. Many of you have jobs, and when you look at your paycheck, you see that you're not only just paying income tax, you're also paying several other taxes as well. And those are usually at flat rates, or all are flat rates, if I remember correctly, besides income tax. So that means we are not simply a straight-up progressive income tax country. We have some of our income that's taxed on a flat rate. And then there are loopholes that the average person can't effectively use. So the tax burden for regular folks versus wealthy folks is actually closer as a percentage than a lot of people would like to believe. Social welfare in the United States. Who deserves to benefit? Americans believe it should be only those who cannot help themselves. There's a preference to give services, not money, to help deserving poor. The national welfare policy came after 22 European nations had already established it. Great Britain established welfare and health care in 1908. Federal involvement in national welfare laws were considered illegal or unconstitutional until the 1930s, when the Supreme Court changed its mind about the New Deal when FDR threatened to pack the courts. There were experiments by state governments. They argued against federal involvement because the state already provided welfare, and then there were some lobbied for federal involvement to help the states. So again, this is a majoritarian welfare program. Social Security Act of 1935 was enacted because state and local relief programs were overwhelmed. There was a two-part plan: insurance for unemployed and elderly, and assistance for dependent children, the blind, and aged. It's a federally funded, state-administered program under a means test. As far as the AFDC, aid to families with dependent children, which is now TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. There's like a 5-year limit on welfare today. Contrary to a lot of popular belief, most people don't even stay on welfare for the limit. The vast majority of people get off of TANF, or welfare, and go find a job. Shocking, I know, because there's the belief that people get on welfare and just stay on it for 50 years, but that's not really how it works, according to statistics. Medicare Act of 1965. Medical benefits had been omitted in 1935. That was controversial, but it was done to make sure it passed. It was broadened by Ways and Means to include Medicaid for poor and to pay doctors' bills for the elderly. So reforming majoritarian welfare programs. Social Security. There's not enough people paying into Social Security to pay the benefits of current recipients, or at least there will be that tipping point here in a few years. So 3 possible solutions: raise the retirement age to 70, freeze the size of retirement benefits, raise Social Security taxes, privatize Social Security, which was, a lot of people were pushing that, and then we had the stock market collapse and people said, well, maybe that's not such a good idea after all. Some combination of the first 2 methods. Medicare, the problem: huge costs, issues with waste and fraud, lots of Medicare fraud. Possible solutions: you could get rid of it and have doctors and hospitals work for the government. Or the elderly could take Medicare money and buy health insurance and join HMOs. Client Welfare Policy, AFDC, is part of the Social Security Act 1935. First federal aid to state programs with states establishing rules. Programs that have been added: food stamps like SNAP, earned income credit. Progressively has lost legitimacy over the years and was abolished in favor of TANF in 1996. Temporary assistance for needy families is no longer an entitlement. There's a 2-year consecutive limit and a 5-year lifetime limit on benefits. You can't have the mythical lifetime welfare queen anymore. 2 kinds of welfare programs. Majoritarian politics: almost everybody pays in benefits, for example, like Social Security and Medicare. Beneficiaries must believe benefits will exceed costs. Political elites must believe in the legitimacy of program. By the way, most of these programs that we're talking about benefit the middle class or the upper class. More of this money gets spent on people who are above poverty rates than below poverty rates. because a lot of these programs are things that you pay into and then you draw out of when you get older. Okay, client politics. Everybody pays, relatively few people benefit. For example, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. Majoritarian politics. Programs with widely distributed benefits and costs. Beneficiaries must believe they will come out ahead. Political elites must believe in legitimacy of the program. Social Security and Medicare looked like a free lunch, but they're really not. People pay into that. Client politics. Programs pass if cost to public is not perceived as great and the client is considered deserving. Today, Americans believe that able-bodied people should work for welfare benefits. Americans prefer a service strategy to income strategy. The fear is that if we just simply give people money, then they won't have an incentive to go find a job. Okay, so here's the chart. It shows millions of recipients on food stamps at the top there, on TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, in the middle, and then Social Security on the bottom there. And you see a big decline in SNAP and Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, going up to 1998. If we looked at numbers from the last 10 years, it would be a little weird because of the recession that we went through. The number of people applying increased quite a bit for a little while. Okay, so will the crunch come? Projections of the growth in federal spending. So this shows projection in billions of dollars that we think we're going to be spending on Social Security and Medicare, and look at the projection for up to, you can tell this is an older PowerPoint. And we are spending a ton on it. We really are. It's a huge part of our budget. It's one of the reasons why it's kind of weird when people focus in on wasted spending. That, you know, if we just get rid of all of these bad ways of spending money, the truth of the matter is most of the money we're spending, it's not something that you can just find an efficient way to spend it, a more efficient way. A lot of the money we're spending is on things that there's no way to make it more efficient. You just pay interest. You just pay Social Security. You know, you can't make it much more efficient. All you can do is change how much you pay. In other words, how much service you give to senior citizens on Social Security, something like that. And you have to pay the interest or else your government defaults on its debts, and it's really bad for the economy. Foreign policy, constitutional legal context. The Constitution creates an invitation to struggle. The President is the commander-in-chief, but Congress appropriates money, and armies need money. The President appoints ambassadors, but the Senate confirms. The President negotiates treaties, but the Senate ratifies. But Americans still act like they think the President is in charge and everything can be solved by an effective President. Presidents are relatively strong in foreign affairs, however, because there are some things they do that Congress can't effectively check. More successes making Congress or getting Congress to do what the President wants in foreign affairs than on domestic affairs. But still, presidents are weaker in foreign affairs than other countries' heads of state. Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt were unable to ally with Great Britain before World War I and World War II, and Wilson was unable to get the United States into the League of Nations, which was his idea. Reagan was criticized on his commitments to El Salvador and Lebanon. Bush had debated with Congress on authorization to fight the Gulf War in 1991. So evaluating the power of the President depends on one's agreement or disagreement with policies. The Supreme Court gives federal government wide powers. It's reluctant to intervene when there's a dispute between Congress and the President. Checks on presidential power are usually political rather than constitutional. Congress can control the purse strings and limit the President's ability to give money or economic aid to other countries. A controversial issue is the War Powers Act of 1973 that says that the President can only have a 60-day commitment of troops without getting authorization by Congress, and all commitments have to be reported within 48 hours. No President has acknowledged its constitutionality. Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton have sent troops without congressional authorization. This has never been taken up into the Supreme Court. mainly because both sides are a little afraid of what the court might decide. You know, this is one of those things where the president doesn't constantly ignore it, but ignores it sometimes, so that Congress doesn't find out once and for all what the limits of their power on this issue are. Okay, public opinion in foreign policy. Before World War II, the public was opposed to the United States' involvement in foreign affairs. World War II shifted popular opinion. It was a universally popular and successful war. The United States emerged as the world's dominant power, and the government was very effective in prosecuting the war, so people were more pro-government than they had been before World War II, and more pro-government than they would be once Vietnam starts. Support for active involvement persisted until Vietnam, and it actually persisted fairly late into the Vietnam War. It wasn't until basically around 1970 that opinion started turning from support from this kind of active position. Backing the president. The public's tendency is to support a president in crises. Presidential support does not decrease with increase in casualties. They support winning the war instead. Four worldviews. Isolationism is the belief that we should oppose involvement in European or other foreign wars. A containment paradigm is a reaction to the appeasement of Hitler, Pearl Harbor. It ended isolationism in the United States. It was a post-war policy to prevent the spread of communism. Disengagement, post-Vietnam. A reaction to military defeat and political disaster of Vietnam, trying to limit how much we use our military and our foreign muscle to try to get things done outside of the United States. Human rights, a human rights position. The liberal opponents of the Gulf War supported military intervention in Kosovo and equated the situation there to genocide. So some people argue that we should support governments that protect human rights and not support governments that don't. And that would create all sorts of interesting issues. The military, of course, is not big on that because some of our best allies in terms of military alliances and capabilities are not very nice to their people. So what do we get for our money? Personnel, from draft to all volunteer force in 1973. More women today in the military. We have the don't ask, don't tell policy on homosexuals in Clinton administration, and under Obama, it's pretty much straight up. There's not much of a limitation on expression of your sexual identity at this point. Big ticket hardware, cost overruns common. Contractors have incentives to underestimate costs. Sole sourcing, gold plating. There are ways for the machinery that we buy for our military to be excessively expensive, is what that's getting at. Closing of military bases. Base closing commission created lists of bases to close, which Congress had to accept in whole, therefore no deal making on which bases to close. Gets a little dicey once in a while. Tinker Air Force Base is up for consideration, but it's such an important logistics center, it's pretty safe. So how the public and the elite see foreign policy. So the public supports tariffs as being necessary to protect American jobs at a 60% rate, leaders 36%. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can read through it on your own by just pausing. Trends in military spending and constant dollars. So these are dollars adjusted for inflation and deflation, things like that. And you can see that our spending right after World War II was very high. And you can see it rose a little bit under Johnson and Nixon with the Vietnam War, dropped down. Reagan raised spending some. It stayed higher up until about 85, 86. Started going down a little bit. The Cold War ends and it decreases. And then if we were to continue past 2000, it would increase as we prosecuted 2 wars. Public sentiment on defense spending. Too little about right is the red line. Too much is the blue line. U.S. military forces before and after the breakup of the Soviet Union. You can see we've decreased the size of our military somewhat since the end of the Cold War. Then we get to environmental policy. This is entrepreneurial politics. One of the issues, of course, is global warming. The Santa Barbara oil spill and Earth Day in 1970 kind of raised awareness, led to the formation of the EPA and passage of the Water Quality Improvement Act, and Tougher Clean Air Act in 1970. There was a book published that became a hit called Silent Spring that dealt with the issue of water quality and things like that. That could come up on an AP exam. 2 years later, Congress passed laws designed to clean up water, 1970. 3 years later, Congress adopted the Endangered Species Act. Public opinion was rallied behind environmental slogans. And then you get to majoritarian politics, pollution from automobiles. The Clean Air Act imposes tough restrictions. The public demanded improvements, required catalytic converters. The emergence of majoritarian politics and auto pollution. States were required to restrict public use of cars, but the effort failed. Opposition was too great. Congress and the EPA has backed down, postponed deadlines. The consumers, auto industry, and unions objected. The Clean Air Act was weakened in 1977, but revived in 1990 with tougher standards. The public will support tough laws if costs are hidden, like with catalytic converters, but not if they have to change their habits, like riding carpools. So, but when people believe the costs are high, like increased gasoline taxes, which discourage driving, save fuel, and reduce smog, most would pay, most would benefit, but the costs came long before the benefits, and so the benefits are not obvious, which makes people resistant to it. It's easier to raise the gas tax if benefits are concrete. For example, if they pay for highways, bridges, and so forth. So the environmental uncertainties. Why is it so difficult to have a sane environmental policy? There are many environmental problems that are not clear-cut. Goals are often unclear. Public opinion can shift. The means of achieving goals are complicated by technical problems. There are economic issues. To really fix some environmental issues would require an economic hit. So how do we achieve our goals? Rules have been replaced by incentives, offsets, bubble standards, pollution allowances. So rules have been established to create an incentive for businesses to try to be cleaner by rewarding them. So major environmental laws concerning smog. The Clean Air Act passed in 1970, amended in 1977 and 1990. So stationary sources. The EPA sets national air quality standards. States must develop plans to attain them. If state plan is inadequate, the EPA sets a federal plan. Local sources that emit more than a certain amount of pollutants must install pollution control equipment like scrubbers. Gasoline-powered vehicles. Between 1970 and 1990, pollution from cars was cut by between 60 and 80%. Between 1991 and 1998, there must be another 30% reduction. Okay, so again, this is another one of these old slides. All states must have an auto pollution inspection system. And recently, there has been an attempt by the administration to try to tighten up and make the standards higher. Cities. Classify cities in terms of how severe their smog problem is and sets deadlines for meeting federal standards. Water. The Clean Water Acts of various years state that there is to be no discharge of wastewater into lakes and streams without a federal permit. To get a permit, cities and factories must meet federal discharge standards. Toxic wastes. The EPA is to clean up abandoned dump sites with money raised by a tax on the chemical and petroleum industries and from general revenues. And there are many thousands of those kinds of sites that exist. Environmental impact statements. Since 1969, any federal agency planning a project that would significantly affect the human environment must prepare in advance an environmental impact statement. Acid rain. The Clean Air Act of 1990 requires a reduction of 10 million tons of sulfur dioxide, mostly from electric generating plants that burn coal, by 1995. The biggest sources must acquire government allowances, which can be traded among firms, setting emission limits. And one of the big arguments now is, one of the big goals is to create something called clean coal. You've probably seen commercials that talk about clean coal, but when we're talking about clean coal, we're talking about cleaner coal than those commercials are talking about. That's kind of the holy grail of the environmental movement in many ways. So question, in general, do you think there is too much, too little government regulation and involvement in the area of environmental protection? And you see the red line there is too little, the blue line is too much, and in the late 90s it looked like they might intersect.